November 9, 1799, Paris. Napoleon Bonaparte stands at the doors of the Council of 500. Inside, France's government is falling apart. Outside, his soldiers wait for orders. He's 30 years old, a war hero, the man who conquered Italy and Egypt. But right now, he's just a general with no legal power. The deputies inside hate him. They know why he's here. One word from them, and he's an outlaw. One move from him, and he's a tyrant. His brother is in there, trying to buy time. The shouting gets louder. Someone yells, "Outlaw him!" The crowd turns hostile. Napoleon's hand moves to his sword. His grenadiers tense up. In the next 60 seconds, he'll either seize absolute power or lose everything. How did a poor kid from Corsica become the man at the center of this moment? And how would this one decision transform him from general to emperor? Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button. Then drop a comment. Do you think Napoleon was a military genius, or just in the right place at the right time? Stick around till the end. I promise you'll see how this moment launched the most powerful empire Europe had seen in centuries. Napoleon Bonaparte, born August 15, 1769. On Corsica, an island that had been under French control for barely a year when he was born. His family was minor Corsican nobility, which sounds impressive until you realize it meant they had a fancy name and almost no money. His father had to beg for scholarships to get Napoleon into French military school, and when he got there, the other kids tormented him. He spoke French with a thick Italian accent. He was short, poor, foreign, and angry. Not exactly the profile of a future emperor. But Napoleon had something the other aristocrat kids didn't, an absolutely insane work ethic. While they partied and focused on social connections, Napoleon buried himself in books, military history, philosophy, mathematics. He studied the campaigns of Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal. By age 16, he could recite battle formations from memory and debate military strategy with his instructors. Then came the French Revolution in 1789. Suddenly, all those old aristocrat officers, gone, guillotined, fled, or purged. The French military was desperately promoting anyone with talent, regardless of birth. For the first time in French history, merit actually mattered more than your last name. Napoleon was in the right place at the right time, sure, but he also had the skills to capitalize on it. At 24, he got his first major command defending Toulon from royalist rebels and British forces. He won decisively through brilliant artillery tactics. At 26, he was a general. 27, he was given command of the struggling army of Italy. And that's where everything changed. Now, here's what made Napoleon different from every other successful general. Most military commanders are good at one thing: tactics, or logistics, or inspiring troops. Napoleon was exceptional at all three. You could plan a campaign months in advance, adjust on the fly when things went wrong, and convince exhausted soldiers to march another 20 miles because they believed he'd lead them to victory. His campaigns in Italy were masterpieces. He took an underfed, under-equipped army and used it to defeat larger Austrian forces repeatedly. He moved fast, struck hard, and never gave his enemies time to regroup. Within a year, he'd conquered most of northern Italy and forced Austria to make peace. He came back to Paris a celebrity. The Directory, the five guys supposedly running France, were terrified of him. He was too popular, too successful, too ambitious. So they did what nervous politicians always do with dangerous generals. They sent him far away. Go conquer Egypt, they said. Cut off Britain's route to India. So Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798. At age 28, he won the initial battles, defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids, and occupied Cairo. It was bold, dramatic, and ultimately a strategic dead end. The British Navy destroyed his fleet, trapping him there. But here's the thing about Napoleon. He understood that perception mattered as much as reality. While stuck in Egypt, he sent carefully crafted dispatches back to France emphasizing his victories and downplaying his problems. To the French public, he was the conquering hero exploring the mysteries of ancient Egypt. In 1799, he abandoned his army in Egypt and secretly sailed back to France. Technically, this was desertion, but France was in such chaos that nobody cared about the technicalities. Why does all this background matter? Because the man who walked into that council chamber on November 9, 1799 wasn't some random ambitious general. He was a 30-year-old who'd been winning impossible victories for 6 years straight, a man who'd never experienced a major defeat, a man who genuinely believed he was destined for greatness. That mindset, that absolute confidence bordering on delusion, is what explains what happened next. Let me paint you a picture of France in 1799. 10 years after the revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, the country was a disaster. The reign of terror had ended 5 years earlier, but its shadow hung over everything. Between 1793 and 1794, the revolutionary government had executed somewhere between 16,000 and 40,000 people. Aristocrats, priests, moderates, radicals who weren't radical enough. The guillotine worked overtime, and the smell of fear never quite left Paris. The directory that replaced the terror was supposed to bring stability. Instead, it brought corruption and incompetence on a spectacular scale. 5 directors shared power, which meant nobody was actually in charge. They spent more time fighting each other than running the country. The economy was in freefall. The assignate revolutionary paper currency was worthless. Inflation was so bad that people literally used money as wallpaper because it was cheaper than actual wallpaper. Food shortages were constant. In Paris, people were starving while government officials lived in luxury, and France was still at war with half of Europe. Britain, Austria, Russia, Naples, they all wanted to crush the revolution and restore the Bourbon monarchy. The Directory kept declaring grand military campaigns and then couldn't pay for them. Soldiers went months without wages. Supplies never arrived. Morale was terrible. But here's the strange part. Despite all this chaos, France was winning, or at least not losing. And that was mostly thanks to generals like Napoleon, who could somehow win battles even when their government forgot to send them bullets. By summer 1799, it was obvious to everyone that the Directory couldn't continue. The question wasn't whether there would be a coup, the question was who would pull it off. Emmanuel Sieyès was one of the 5 directors. Unlike his colleagues, Sieyès actually gave a damn about fixing France. He was a political theorist, one of the intellectual architects of the revolution, and he'd come to a conclusion. The revolution's ideals needed a strong executive to survive. Democracy is great in theory, but in practice, when your legislature spends more time debating than governing, you need someone who can actually make decisions and make them stick. Sieyès started plotting a coup in mid-1799. His plan was elegant. Find a general with a big reputation, use him to intimidate the legislature into creating a new constitution, then quietly sideline him once the new system was in place. He approached General Joubert first. Joubert died in battle before they could act. He approached General Moreau next. Moreau said no, he wasn't interested in politics. That left Napoleon, who had just gotten back from Egypt, who was already a celebrity, who was definitely interested in politics. They met in secret in early October 1799. Sieyès explained his plan. Napoleon listened, nodded, and immediately started modifying it. Here's the problem with your plan, Napoleon said. You want to use the threat of military force without actually using military force. That only works if everyone believes you'll follow through. And for that, you need someone the soldiers actually worship. Sieyès smiled. And that's why you're here. Also, Napoleon continued, we need someone inside the legislature, someone who can control the proceedings, stall for time if needed, and call votes at exactly the right moment. Who do you suggest? My brother Lucien, he's president of the Council of 500. Perfect. An inside man and an outside threat. All they needed was the right moment and the right pretext. They set the date for November 9, 1799 to 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar. The plan had 3 stages. Stage 1. Convince the Council of Elders, the upper house, that there's a Jacobin conspiracy to restart the terror. Everyone's still terrified of the Jacobins, so they'll vote to move the government to St. Cloud outside Paris for safety. They'll also vote to put Napoleon in command of all troops in Paris for protection. Stage 2. Once at St. Cloud, away from the Paris mob, use the threat of military force to pressure the legislature into dissolving the Directory and creating a new government with a stronger executive. Stage 3. Install a new 3-person consulate to run France. Sieyès would handle the politics. Napoleon would provide the military backing, and Roger Ducos, another director, would be the 3rd vote. Simple, right? The beauty of the plan was its pseudo-legality. They wouldn't be overthrowing the government, they'd be convincing the government to reform itself. Intimidation, not invasion. Persuasion, not force, or at least, that was the plan. November 9th. The first move. The morning of November 9th started perfectly. The Council of Elders met first. Size and his allies stood up and gave impassioned speeches about the Jacobin threat. They had fake intelligence reports, dramatic warnings, fear-mongering at its finest. The elders panicked exactly as planned. They voted to move the government to Selau. They voted to put Napoleon in command of all troops in Paris. Napoleon showed up in his best uniform to accept command. He gave a short speech about protecting the Republic from its enemies. Very noble. Very patriotic. Everyone applauded. By noon, Napoleon was legally in command of every soldier in Paris. He had his cover story, he had his authority. All he needed was for the legislature to go along with the plan tomorrow at St. Cloud that night. Napoleon met with his key officers, Maratlan's Berthier, men who'd served with him in Italy and Egypt, men who'd follow him anywhere. Tomorrow, Napoleon told them, "We save France." One of them asked, "And if the legislature doesn't cooperate?" Napoleon smiled. "They will. They just don't know it yet." But he was wrong. The next morning, everyone gathered at the Palace of St. Cloud, 10 miles outside Paris. The palace was surrounded by Napoleon's troops, grenadiers in full uniform, cavalry, artillery, about 6,000 soldiers total. The message was clear: we're here to protect you. Don't make us do anything else. The Council of Elders met first and, once again, cooperated. They were older, more conservative, more scared. They voted to form a commission to draft a new constitution perfect. Now came the Council of 500, and this is where everything went wrong. The 500 were younger, more radical, more committed to revolutionary ideals. They'd actually read Rousseau and meant it. And when they assembled at St. Cloud surrounded by Napoleon's soldiers, they immediately understood what was happening. This wasn't about protecting the Republic. This was a military takeover. The session opened with chaos. Deputies jumped to their feet, shouting accusations. Some demanded an investigation into the Jacobin conspiracy that was obviously fake. Others wanted to know why the hell they were surrounded by soldiers. Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, was supposed to maintain order as president of the 500. Believe me, he couldn't control this crowd. "Citizens," Lucien shouted, "please, if we could just down with the tyrant." Someone yelled. "What tyrant?" Lucien asked, though everyone knew the answer. "Your brother?" The chamber erupted. For 3 hours, the 500 argued, shouted, and accomplished nothing. Outside, Napoleon was pacing. His troops were ready. The elders had cooperated. All he needed was for Lucien to get the 500 to vote, but Lucien couldn't get him to vote on anything. They were too busy arguing about whether this whole thing was legitimate. At around 4 p.m., Napoleon made a decision, a very Napoleon decision. He'd just walk in there himself, use his reputation, his charisma, his presence to intimidate them into submission. After all, he'd faced down enemy armies. How scary could a room full of lawyers be? Very scary, as it turned out. Napoleon entered the chamber of the 500. The moment the deputies saw him, they swarmed. Outlaw him. Down with the dictator. Respect the Republic. Dozens of deputies surrounded Napoleon. They weren't attacking him physically well. Not quite, but they were pushing, shouting in his face, grabbing at his uniform. The man who'd stood calmly under artillery fire in Italy was visibly shaken by angry legislators. Some accounts say Napoleon went pale and might have fainted. Napoleon later denied this vehemently, claiming he was just momentarily disoriented by the hostile reception. Either way, it wasn't going well. His grenadiers rushed in and physically carried him out of the chamber. Picture this: the great Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of Italy and Egypt, being carried out of a room by his own soldiers because some lawyers yelled at him. Not his finest hour. Outside, Napoleon was shaking. His officers surrounded him, asking for orders. But for maybe the first time in his military career, Napoleon didn't have a plan. Inside, the 500 were now actively debating a motion to outlaw Napoleon Bonaparte. If they passed it, he'd become a fugitive. Everything would be over. Lucien was desperately trying to stall, but he was losing control of the chamber. This is the moment. Right here. This is where Napoleon either becomes emperor or becomes a footnote. Lucian made a choice. He abandoned his post as president of the 500, walked out of the chamber, and found the soldiers. Citizens, Lucian shouted to the troops, "The president of the council is in danger. Assassins with daggers have invaded the assembly. They're threatening their representatives. We must restore order." It was complete fiction. Nobody had daggers. Nobody was threatening anyone. But Lucian sold it with the performance of his life. The soldiers believed him, or at least, they pretended to. These were Napoleon's men. They'd followed him across Italy and into Egypt. If his brother said there were assassins, well, that was good enough for them. General Murat turned to his troops. "Fix bayonets. We're clearing the chamber." The soldiers marched into the hall where the 500 were meeting. Imagine being a deputy in that moment. You're in the middle of a heated debate about constitutional procedure, and suddenly armed soldiers are coming at you with bayonets. The deputies panicked. Some tried to flee through the doors, but soldiers blocked them. So they did the only thing they could. They jumped out the windows. I want you to picture this. The legislature of France, the representatives of the people, the guardians of the Republic, literally jumping out of windows to escape a military coup. Some historians say this is when the French Revolution truly ended. The moment elected representatives fled from bayonets. Within 20 minutes the chamber was empty except for Lucian and Napoleon, and a handful of deputies who were sympathetic to the coup or too slow to jump out the windows. Lucian quickly called for a vote. All in favor of dissolving the Directory and creating a new provisional government. The handful of remaining deputies, surrounded by armed soldiers, raised their hands. "The motion passes unanimously," Lucian declared. And just like that, the French Revolution ate itself one last time. That night, November 10, 1799, the new provisional government was announced. 3 consuls would rule France: Size, Ducos, and Napoleon. Except not really. From the first meeting it was clear who was in charge. Size had this elaborate constitutional plan, lots of checks and balances, multiple assemblies, complicated voting procedures, very democratic, very enlightened. Napoleon listened for about 10 minutes, then said, "Too complicated. Here's what we'll do instead." And he outlined a system where the first consul, guess who, would have all the real power. The other 2 consuls could advise and vote, but the first consul made the final decisions. Size was stunned, but that's not what we agreed. "We agreed to save France." Napoleon interrupted. "This is how we do it. Unless you have a better idea." Size didn't. Napoleon had the army. Napoleon had the popularity. Napoleon had the momentum. On December 25, 1799, the new constitution was announced. Napoleon Bonaparte was first consul. Size and Ducos were his advisors. The Republic was saved, except the Republic was also, for all practical purposes, France was now ruled by one man. And Napoleon's first years as first consul showed his true genius, not just as a military leader, but as a political operator. He did something brilliant. He gave people what they actually wanted, not what revolutionary ideology said they should want. The revolutionaries wanted equality and democratic participation. Cool. But what the French people actually wanted in 1799 was food, jobs, safety, and for the government to stop executing people. Napoleon delivered. He reformed the financial system, created the Bank of France, stabilized the currency, got inflation under control. Within a year, bread was affordable again. He reformed the legal system. Dozens of lawyers spent months compiling and organizing French law into one coherent code. The Napoleonic Code established equality before the law, religious tolerance, property rights, merit-based advancement, and secular civil authority. It also, and we should mention this, restricted women's rights compared to some revolutionary area laws. Women couldn't own property independently, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't work without their husband's permission, so it wasn't all enlightened progress. But for men, the Napoleonic Code was revolutionary. It abolished feudal privileges, ended the power of the Catholic Church over civil matters, and enshrined the principle that your birth didn't determine your destiny. He also made peace. In 1800, Napoleon personally led an army across the Alps into Italy, because, apparently, just being first consul wasn't enough excitement, and defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. It was close, almost a disaster, but Napoleon turned it into a propaganda victory. Austria sued for peace. By 1802, Even Britain agreed to a treaty. For the first time in a decade, France was at peace with all of Europe, and the French people loved him for it. Here's where Napoleon showed his strategic political instincts. In 1802, he held a plebiscite, a national vote on whether he should be consul for life. The vote was 3.6 million in favor, 8,000 against. Now, was this a completely fair free election? Of course not. There was intimidation, vote manipulation, and lots of propaganda. But it's also true that Napoleon was genuinely popular. He'd brought stability, he'd brought peace, he'd made France work again. Being consul for life wasn't enough though, because consul still implied republican government. Napoleon wanted something more. In 1804, another plebiscite. This one asked whether Napoleon Bonaparte should become Emperor of France. 3.5 million voted yes, 2,500 voted no. On December 2, 1804, in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of the French. Pope Pius VII was there to legitimize it. All the old nobility showed up, along with Napoleon's family and his loyal generals. According to legend, when the Pope moved to place the crown on Napoleon's head, Napoleon took it and crowned himself. The message, "I don't receive power from the church, I take it myself." Whether that actually happened is debated by historians, but it's such a perfect Napoleon moment that it should be true. The poor kid from Corsica, the one mocked for his accent, the one who had to beg for scholarships, was now Emperor of France. He was 35 years old, but Napoleon wasn't satisfied ruling just France. That would be like Alexander the Great stopping after Macedonia. Between 1805 and 1812, Napoleon reshaped Europe through a series of brilliant military campaigns. The War of the Third Coalition 1805. Austria and Russia allied to destroy France. Napoleon responded by marching his Grande Armée across Europe at unprecedented speed. At Austerlitz, he defeated a combined Austrian-Russian force in what's considered his masterpiece battle. Austria sued for peace. Russia. The War of the Fourth Coalition 1806 to 1807. Prussia decided to challenge France. Bad idea. Napoleon crushed the Prussian army at Jena and Austerlitz in a single day. Then he marched all the way to Poland and defeated Russia again at Friedland. The Tsar of Russia met Napoleon on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River and agreed to an alliance. By 1807, Napoleon controlled France, Belgium, the Netherlands, large parts of Germany, Italy, and Poland. His brothers were kings of Spain, Naples, and Westphalia. His stepson was Viceroy of Italy. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient patchwork of German states that had existed for 1,000 years, was dissolved. Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine in its place, directly under French influence. Only Britain remained unconquered, and Britain refused to make permanent peace. The British Navy controlled the seas, the French army controlled the land. It was a stalemate that would eventually destroy them both. What made Napoleon's empire different from previous conquerors? Most empires in history worked like this. Conquer a place, extract tribute, install a loyal governor, move on. Rome did it. The Mongols did it. Pretty standard. Napoleon did something different. He tried to remake conquered territories in France's image. The Napoleonic Code was introduced across Europe. Feudalism was abolished. The power of the Catholic Church was reduced. Education was reformed. Merit-based civil service was established. In Germany, Napoleon consolidated 300-plus tiny states into about 40 larger ones. This accidentally created the foundation for German unification, later Ironica, since German nationalism was partly formed in opposition to French occupation. In Italy, Napoleon created the Kingdom of Italy in the north and installed his relatives as rulers in Naples. For the first time in centuries, Italians started thinking of themselves as one people rather than Venetians, Romans, Florentines. In Poland, Napoleon created the Duchy of Warsaw, not full independence, but the first Polish state in years after it had been partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Napoleon wasn't trying to be benevolent. He was trying to create an efficient, modern system that could support his armies and compete with Britain's economic power. But the side effect was that he spread Enlightenment ideas across Europe at gunpoint. Liberty, equality, meritocracy, these stopped being just French revolutionary slogans and became actual law in dozens of countries. Here's what we tend to forget about Napoleon's glory years. They were also years of constant, brutal warfare. The Grande Army at its peak numbered 600,000 men. Most were French, but Napoleon also conscripted troops from every territory he controlled. Italians, Germans, Poles, Dutch, everyone fed the war machine. Between 1803 and 1815, Napoleon's wars killed somewhere between 3 and 6 million people. Soldiers, civilians, casualties from disease and famine. The numbers are hard to pin down, but they're staggering. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to blockade Britain, economically caused hardship across Europe. No British goods meant no sugar, coffee, cotton. Smuggling became rampant. Enforcement required constant military presence. And the conscription never stopped. Every year, thousands of young Frenchmen were drafted. Every year, fewer came home. By 1813, Napoleon was drafting 16-year-olds because he'd run out of older men. The glory was real. The transformation of Europe was real. But so was the suffering. By 1810, Napoleon stood at the peak of his power. Let's take inventory of what he controlled. Direct French territory, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, northern Italy, and the Illyrian provinces along the Adriatic. Satellite kingdoms ruled by his family. Spain, his brother Joseph. Naples, his brother-in-law Murat. Westphalia, his brother Jerome. Italy, his stepson Eugene. Allied states, Switzerland, the Confederation of the Rhine, German states, the Duchy of Warsaw, Poland. Forced allies through defeat, Austria, Prussia, Denmark. Only Britain, Russia for now, Sweden, Sicily, and Portugal remained outside his system. Napoleon divorced Josephine in 1809 because she couldn't give him an heir. In 1810, he married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor. The upstart Corsican was now related by marriage to the oldest royal house in Europe. In 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son. Napoleon named him Napoleon II and gave him the title King of Rome. The empire had an heir. The dynasty seemed secure. This was it. This was the moment. The height of Napoleon's power. Europe hadn't seen anything like this since Charlemagne 1,000 years earlier. One man, one system, dominating the entire continent. How did Napoleon build this empire? Several factors. Military genius. Napoleon really was one of history's great military commanders. He pioneered the corps system, where armies were divided into self-sufficient units that could operate independently. He moved faster than his enemies expected. He concentrated force at decisive points. He promoted based on merit, which meant his officers were competent, not just well-born. Revolutionary energy. Napoleon harnessed the ideological power of the French Revolution. His soldiers weren't just fighting for a king, they were fighting for liberty, equality, and meritocracy. That's powerful motivation. Weak opposition. The old monarchies of Europe were sclerotic, slow, and still relied on aristocratic officers who'd bought their commissions. They couldn't adapt to Napoleon's speed and aggression. Economic resources. Napoleon controlled the economic heartland of Europe. He could tax rich territories like northern Italy and the Rhineland to fund his armies. Personal charisma. Napoleon had that rare quality where soldiers would follow him into hell. After Austerlitz, his troops called him the Little Corporal as a term of endearment. They believed he was lucky, that God favored him. The Napoleonic method. Napoleon didn't just conquer, he transformed. By spreading the code, building roads, reforming administration, he made conquered territories more efficient and valuable. But empires built on military genius have a problem. They depend on continued military success. And in 1812, Napoleon made the mistake that would destroy everything. The invasion of Russia. Tsar Alexander I of Russia had been Napoleon's ally since 1807, but by 1810, the relationship was deteriorating. The continental system, Napoleon's blockade of British trade, was hurting Russia economically. The Russians needed to export grain and timber. They needed British manufactured goods. The blockade was killing them. Alexander started ignoring the restrictions. Russian ports opened to neutral ships that just happened to carry British goods. Napoleon couldn't let this slide. If Russia broke the continental system, it would collapse everywhere. Britain would survive. The war would continue indefinitely. In Napoleon's mind, there was only one solution: invade Russia, force Alexander back into line, and show the rest of Europe that defying Napoleon had consequences. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grande Army numbered men, French, Germans, Italians, Poles, Dutch, a truly multinational force. They marched into Russia, and Russia swallowed them whole. The Russians refused to fight a decisive battle. They retreated, burning everything as they went. Crops, villages, supplies, all destroyed. The Grande Army marched deeper and deeper into Russia, finding nothing but scorched earth. Napoleon captured Moscow in September 1812. The city was empty. Then it caught fire, probably set by the Russians themselves. 3/4 of Moscow burned. Napoleon waited in the ruins for Alexander to negotiate. Alexander never responded. In October, with winter approaching and supplies exhausted, Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat. The retreat from Russia was a catastrophe. Russian cavalry harassed the flanks. Partisan fighters attacked supply lines. Then winter hit early and hard. The Grande Army that marched into Russia in June numbered 680,000. The army that staggered back out in December numbered maybe 100,000. Napoleon had lost 580,000 men. Along with them, he lost the aura of invincibility. The disaster in Russia changed everything. All across Europe, the conquered peoples saw that Napoleon could be beaten. Prussia switched sides. Austria switched sides. Even some German states in the Confederation of the Rhine began negotiating with the Allies. In 1813, Napoleon raised a new army because the man was nothing if not persistent, and fought a series of battles across Germany. He won some, lost some, but couldn't win decisively because he was outnumbered for the first time. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, called the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced a combined Prussian, Russian, Austrian, and Swedish army. He lost decisively. The retreat from Germany mirrored the retreat from Russia. Napoleon's empire was collapsing. By early 1814, Allied armies were invading France itself. Napoleon fought brilliantly with what little forces he had left. His 1814 campaign is considered a masterpiece of defensive warfare, but brilliance couldn't overcome 2-to-1 numerical odds. In April 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon's marshals refused to keep fighting. They'd had enough. On April 11, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. He was exiled to Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy. The Bourbon monarchy was restored. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, became king. The empire was over. Napoleon was 44 years old, but it wasn't over. Napoleon spent 10 months on Elba, 10 months watching Europe try to put itself back together at the Congress of Vienna. The restored Bourbon monarchy was unpopular. Louis XVIII brought back the old nobility with their old privileges. The Napoleonic reforms were being rolled back. Veterans found themselves unwanted. The economy struggled, and Napoleon, stuck on his island, read the reports and thought, they need me. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba with about 1,000 loyal soldiers. He landed in France on March 1st. Louis XVIII sent the army to arrest him. But when the soldiers saw Napoleon, they didn't arrest him, they joined him. Regiment after regiment defected to Napoleon as he marched toward Paris. By the time he reached the capital on March 20th, he had an army again. Louis XVIII fled. Without a shot being fired, Napoleon was back in power. This period, Napoleon's return, is called the 100 Days, because that's how long it lasted. Europe wasn't going to let Napoleon come back. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia immediately declared war. They assembled armies totaling over 800,000 men. Napoleon could raise maybe 200,000. He'd have to defeat them piecemeal before they could unite. In June 1815, Napoleon marched into Belgium to attack the British and Prussian armies before they could link up. On June 18, 1815, near a small Belgian town called Waterloo, Napoleon fought his last battle. He almost won. He came very, very close. But a series of mistakes, bad luck, and the timely arrival of Prussian reinforcements turned the tide. By evening, the French army was routed and Napoleon fled the field. The 100 Days were over. This time the Allies weren't taking chances. No pleasant Mediterranean island. No comfortable house with servants. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a remote volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the nearest land. British warships patrolled constantly to make sure he stayed there. He lived in a damp house called Longwood, with a small household of loyal followers. He wrote his memoirs. He argued with the British governor. He complained about everything. His health deteriorated: stomach pains, weaknesses, nausea. By 1821 he was clearly dying. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at age 51. The official cause was stomach cancer. Some historians suspect arsenic poisoning from the wallpaper in his house, which contained arsenic-based dye that could leach out in damp conditions. We'll probably never know for sure. His last words were, reportedly, France. Army. Head of the army. Josephine. He was buried on St. Helena. But in 1840, the French government brought his body back to Paris today. Napoleon lies in a massive tomb at Les Invalides, one of the most visited sites in France. The poor kid from Corsica got a monument fit for an emperor after all. So that's the rise of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, from mocked outsider to master of Europe in just 15 years. How did he do it? Right place, right time helps. But it wasn't just luck. Napoleon had three things going for him. First, genuine military genius. The guy could read a battlefield like others read books. Second, the ideological power of the revolution. His soldiers believed they were fighting for something more than just conquest. Third, and maybe most important, absolute unwavering self-belief. Napoleon never doubted he was destined for greatness. That confidence carried him from that chaotic moment at St. Cloud in 1799 to the throne of France in 1804. It kept him winning battles across Europe for a decade. And ironically, that same confidence, that inability to accept limits, destroyed him in Russia. Napoleon transformed Europe. The Napoleonic Code influenced legal systems from Louisiana to Japan. The national boundaries he drew in Germany and Italy shaped modern nations. His promotion of meritocracy helped end feudalism across the continent, but he also caused immense suffering. Millions died in his wars. Countries were occupied. Resources were extracted. That glory came at a terrible cost. Was he worth it? That's for you to decide. Napoleon was both the last great enlightened despot and the first modern dictator, both a champion of revolutionary ideals and a betrayer of republican democracy, both a military genius and a megalomaniac who couldn't stop. What's undeniable is this: that 60-second moment on November 10, 1799, when Napoleon stood outside the council chamber and decided to let his brother call in the troops, changed world history. From that decision came an empire, a code of laws, and a legend that still fascinates us over 2 centuries later. Sometimes the rise to power comes down to a single choice in a single moment. Napoleon made his choice, and Europe would never be the same. Comment below, hero or tyrant? What's your verdict on Napoleon? Subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that changed history. See you in the next one.